is on. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right. So, really, I would like to start off by thanking the chair and PPD for inviting me to this very, very important meeting. As it's a year really of 25 years of PPD, 25 years of ICPD, and 50 years of existence of UNFPA. So there's a lot to celebrate in terms of our joint efforts to improve, population, the understanding and actions on addressing population and development issues in the global south. As we know, the PPD countries really constitute the bigger chunk of the global population. So whatever that happens in this network will be very, very critical in getting us forward in terms of looking at the SDG Agenda 2030, as well as how we are looking at ICPD 25 and looking at what we do going to 2030. Again, just to recap here, we are looking really at ICPD. We are looking at the SDGs and how the demographic dividend can actually be used as a framework to help the world further the objectives that the ICPD and SDGs have. And I think if you just look at the Nairobi Summit themes, the slide that I'm showing here, the conference in Nairobi happening in November, which will mark the 25th celebration of ICPD, but more critically, provide a platform for countries to make very, very specific, actionable commitments on what we should do heading to 2030. There are 5 main themes there. We're looking at universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights as part of universal health coverage, if you look at the SDG framework. Financing required to complete the ICPD program of action, drawing on the demographic diversity. How do we use the demographic diversity across the developing world to drive economic growth and achieve sustainable development, ending gender-based violence and harmful practices, and the 5th one is upholding the right to sexual and reproductive health. What we are talking about mainly here is the 3rd bullet, which is looking at demographic diversity. How do we really look at demographic diversity to drive economic growth? And we are focusing on the demographic dividend. I'll get into this in a little while. But when you look at that first slide, and then you look at the SDG framework, you see that if we really talk about the SDGs, the running theme is how do we make sure that we leave no one behind? And there are a number of factors that are looking, a number of SDGs that are looking at poverty alleviation, trying to fight poverty, trying to fight hunger, improving education, mainly focusing on improving the well-being of people. So really the main question that we ask when we talk about SDGs is how do we make sure that everybody is given a chance to thrive, as opposed to barely surviving, which is what maybe the MDGs we're focusing on. So we have economic, we have rights issues related to inclusive growth and so on. We look at gender, we look at education, but there's a bunch of all those other environmental factors. So really, when we look at the SDGs, it's, in my view, it's a remarriage of the old sustainable development definition, where we are saying, how do we take care of the needs of the current and future generations without hurting the environment? And when you really look at that, you need to understand that people, the population, have to be at the center of any discussion related to sustainable development. So what the demographic dividend does basically is it allows us really to marry these two concepts, the SDGs and the ICPD, where we are looking at a lot of the rights to do with reproductive health, making sure that people have children when they want them, that we do not have unnecessary deaths of women as they try to give birth and so on, the rights issues surrounding reproductive health, and then we look at the economic issues that economic interventions that need to come about in order to improve well-being, job creation, education, health of the population and so on, that is under the SDG. So as we get started in this session, I really want to put on the table the proposition that focusing on the demographic dividend is very, very critical in trying really to put people at the center of the SDG framework, as well as reinforce what the ICPD is trying to do. My talk is mainly going to focus on Africa. I know there are a number of participants here who comment on this from the perspective of the other regions. But when you really look at Africa, the African population story in the coming century is really in three parts. It's the numbers growing from 1.2 billion now to 3.3 billion, doubling by 2070. But I think what will be more critical is also that the age structure of the population is going to change. Africa is the youngest population now. It will remain young, but with more concentration of people in the working ages. And as this transition happens, that's what we mean when we talk about the demographic dividend. How will Africa take advantage of this transition when now it has more people in the working age population as compared to people who are dependent children? The third big population dynamic happening in Africa is the change from the population being rural-dominated to urban-dominated. By 2032, it's estimated that Africa will actually be more urban than rural. And the question we need to ask ourselves, even when we talk about population dynamics, the links between population and development is Africa going to be ready to take advantage of this? Urbanization has been a driver of socioeconomic transformation and development in the emerging countries, in the developed countries. But if African urban areas continue to be the hubs of poverty, where most of the people are living in slum settlements, being deprived of livelihoods and jobs and basic services, then there's a chance that Africa can lose this opportunity. So the numbers are going to grow, the age structure is going to change, the distribution of the population, rural-urban, is going to change. Amidst this, I think the big question, the demographic dividend question for Africa is Africa going to be ready to take advantage of these population dynamics to drive its socioeconomic transformation agenda? A fourth sort of factor, which is very, very critical for Africa, is also the issue about the environment. We know that population challenges in Africa are really being compounded by the adverse effects of climate change that the continent is facing. We did this analysis just to look at which countries in Africa are actually having what you might call more precarious population dynamics in terms of rapid population growth, high levels of unmet need for family planning, high levels of unwanted childbirth, and so on, and trying to link that to climate change effects, projections of food insecurity, and so on. And what you see here is that 15 countries in Africa could be classified as hotspot countries, where high rates of population growth, which have high rates of population growth and high projected decline in agricultural production and raw resilience to climate change. 4 of these countries, Burkina Faso, Djibouti, Malawi, and Somalia, actually also have water scarcity, serious water scarcity, and many of the hotspots already have widespread poverty and so on. So when we talk about demographic dividend, when we talk about how Africa can take advantage of its population dynamics to accelerate socioeconomic transformation, we need to bring in the issue about climate change and environment as well. So the demographic dividend, probably everybody here knows what it means, but just to recap, we talk about the economic, we need to understand that the demographic dividend has 2 parts, right? The first demographic dividend refers to the economic benefit that arises from the increase in the ratio of working age adults relative to young and old dependents. So that's the first dividend. When you are coming from an age structure that has more dependents and you are moving from there, you reap economic benefits that will help you to develop as a country. But there's the second demographic dividend as well, which are the long-term effects of these initial benefits that countries actually have. And this takes even a longer period, and estimates by economists show that the second demographic dividend is actually more impactful, that it has more effect on economic growth and well-being than the first demographic dividend. So, as I said, we are moving from an age structure that is dominated by young dependents to the time when you have more working age people. But what we need to know is that this is a short-term phenomenon, because over time the population is going to become aged and we'll have more elderly people than even the workers. I think the question is, as the population shifts from the first graph to the second, to the third, our country is going to be ready to take advantage of this demographic change. And I think one critical point we need to note here is that a lot of us in developing countries in Africa tend to say, oh, we have a youth budge in Africa, let's take advantage of our youth budge. I think the statistics actually show that many African countries now don't have a youth budge yet. What we have is a child budge, because for you to create a youth budge, you need to get to that point where birth rates actually are going to get lowered to around between 2 and 3 or so, which now cuts that base to start giving you the big cohort that will then, as it moves up the age groups, can give you these big economic benefits. So look at South Korea, the real example of South Korea. That's what happens. You move from high child dependency, more workers, and more elderly people. As you move, how do you gain from this? You look at African countries, you can classify African countries into 5 groups, 5 typologies. The first one of the things actually we need to keep emphasizing is that Africa actually has a demographic dividend as well. You look at countries like Tunisia, where our hosts here, you look at Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, birth rates are already below 3 in these countries. The age structures have already changed, and they already have more working age populations than dependent children. And in all these countries, the critical thing to note is that actually incomes have gone up. There might be many other factors, but incomes have gone up. But I think the main point we've always noted is that these countries have not harnessed the same level of the demographic dividend as the countries in South Asia have done. But there is an African demographic dividend that is ongoing now. The second group of countries are countries that where birth rates have started declining. They are maybe around between 4 and 3 or so. And what needs to happen in these countries? So in the first countries where the demographic dividend is underway already, like, you look at Botswana, Swaziland, South Africa, Tunisia, the main interventions that need to happen need to focus more on really job creation, because the main problem there is low employment rates for young people. And also reskilling the population, skill development that will make this youthful population become more competitive as they go on. The second group of countries are countries where birth rates have gone down a little bit. You can combine groups in group 2. These are countries where birth rates have gone down, and the main sort of intervention push has to be to help countries accelerate the fertility decline, but at the same time reforming education systems to make sure that the populations are going to be well educated, well skilled, as well as focusing on job creation and so on. But I think there are a few countries now. I think Africa is really changing. It's not as rapid as other countries are. You can look at the third category, the last category, which is mainly 2 countries, Niger and Chad, where birth rates are above 6. The rest has been changing there. So there as well, you need to make sure that you help accelerate the birth rates, to change the age structure, even as you look at the human capital improvement aspects. So basically, the point is, in those majority of African countries where birth rates are still relatively just beginning to decline or relatively high, what do you need to do? The first thing has to be to create this youth badge. And to create the youth badge, we need to look at, we need to make sure that we address unmet need for family planning, a provision of high-quality contraceptives. We need to make sure there's uptake of those contraceptives. But there's also the big issue about keeping girls in school, which will be critical in increasing age at marriage and so on. And also child survival is a very, very critical factor, and it's an area where many African countries, despite making progress under the MDG framework, the levels are still much, much higher than the countries in Southeast Asia. And so there's need there to continue, if we have to create the youth badge to reduce birth rates, we need interventions on, to do with female labor participation, changing norms of female empowerment and child survival. But when we go to now from the youth badge to the DD, then that's where we need to make sure that there's high human capital, there's high quality human capital, the policies and registrations are in place to accelerate these interventions and so on. So I'm going to move fast, but this is just a summary, what needs to be done really. I think what we are saying here is that make family planning universally accessible, which is linked to both the SDGs and the ICPD agenda. We need to make sure that there's education that is focused on making the population more productive, job creation, but I think the critical one that we are putting there is the environment one, which I talked about. So maybe in a couple of minutes, the issue about looking at countries, not just cramping every African country together, looking at these different places. This is a case of Botswana, for instance, where we used the National Transfer Accounts analysis to look at how are the dependency ratios in Botswana. So in blue here, you look at what the countries are actually consuming at different ages, from 0 to age 90. And the yellow one is showing you the income that the country is producing from labor income. So what you see there is that in the area part, there's a lot of dependency. People are consuming but not producing. And in the middle part, there's only a very, very slight, that intersection between blue and yellow. That's the only income that a country like Botswana is producing. The people are producing beyond, are producing beyond what they are consuming. So if you translate that into a life deficit sort of calculation, you see that in Botswana, actually the surplus that the labor population, the labor age, the working age population is producing is only about 2.5 billion pula, the one that is below there, the surplus with the green part. But the others are actually consuming more than they are producing. And the question you need to ask yourself is, when you look at the amounts that are above and below, you see that the country is actually living beyond its means. It's actually consuming much more than what it's producing. And so when you compare that with Botswana as well, this is a chart that is showing you the surplus, the per capita life deficit, the age when people are producing. Everything that is below, it means that you are actually producing more than you are consuming, and above you are consuming more than you are producing. And you see, Botswana, young people are dependent up to age 33. They're actually, so we tend to say age dependency age is 0 to 15, but here they are going to age 33 when they're actually consuming more than they are producing. In South Africa, it's about age 28. But if you look at upper middle income countries as an average, it's about 26, 27. So African countries, this issue about high unemployment for young people, it's really very, very critical. And if Africa has to harness the demographic dividend, that's where the focus really has to be. And I think for Botswana, I want to emphasize this. For Botswana, if you look at the improvement in the well-being of Botswana over the last 25 years or so, yeah, we are saying that they haven't harnessed the level of demographic dividend that the Asian tigers have done. But we can conclude from the analysis that Botswana, out of the well-being that Botswana has achieved, 24% of it can already be attributed to the decline in fertility, to the demographic dividend that the country has achieved. But the country can achieve another 12%, but to do that, there has to be specific policies to address the areas that I was talking about. So how do we move from numbers to action? I'm concluding, Mr. Chair. Given what I've said here, and where I think our organization, I work at AFIDEP, the African Institute for Development Policy, we work with governments across Africa, we work with the African Union to really translate evidence and try to help governments understand these population dynamics and what actions they should take to really use our population dynamics as a tool for socioeconomic transformation. What we've come to conclude is that in every country, we've worked now in about, 16 countries since 2017 when the African Union designated the demographic dividend as the main development theme. We've worked in 16 countries, and in all these countries, where the agenda is now is that a lot of countries are saying, we get it, what should we do, how should we do it? So these are the questions, and these are the gaps where I think South-South partnership could come in. It's doing now in-depth policy prioritization, trying to demonstrate which interventions will give the highest returns to the investment. That's where the big gap is. The second gap is really, how do you integrate the demographic dividend principles and interventions into development planning, as well as in the budgeting processes? How do you do that in practical terms? The third one is improving coordination, as well as how do we bring the private sector? It's the private sector that will create jobs ultimately. It's not the governments and so on, but how do we provide that enabling environment for the private sector to actually get that job done? And fourthly, it's mobilization of sustainable funding. Some governments come and say, oh, demographic dividend, maybe you're coming with a new bag of money, and there's a lot of interest in that, thinking that it will come with resources. But the point has to be made that this is not about bringing necessarily new money. It's more effective use of the budgets that we already have. And as we generate more money, making sure that we are channeling these funds into areas that will help accelerate transformation in these countries. And finally, it's the issue about performance monitoring and accountability. How do we know that we are making progress? What are the indicators we use that countries are moving forward? I think we need to pay attention to that. So the point is there is need for more technical assistance. The PPD framework is very, very fortunate. We already have countries who are at very, very different levels of the demographic dividend. China, India, and other countries in Asia that have actually gone ahead. Our African countries, virtually every African country, in their long-term development plans, they say that they are benchmarking their development path to how the Asian countries are developed. So, but the point is, what is the actual technology transfer or knowledge transfer that is happening between these two streams of countries? There's a bit that is happening, but I think much more can be done. So I think it's technical assistance. It's not preaching on what is important. I think everybody now seems to understand what the issues are. It's really how do we get it done? How do we change the planning? How do we change the budgeting so that the funds are going into all these areas? And I think it's also the recognition that Africa, I think the big question is, where will Africa's jobs come from? It's the recognition that it may not be the Industrial Revolution that helped the West and the emerging East Asia. It may come more from ICT, from innovation. And how do we help Africa leapfrog the sort of a normal way of transforming to actually become the hub for innovation, to use its youthful population as a driving force for development? Finally, I think it's the issue about the South-South partnerships. Part of the big challenge we've had with the North-South partnerships is that the North sometimes tends to come because they bring the big money on the table. They want to dominate discussions and kind of lecture on what happens. I think we also need to make sure that South-South partnership is based on mutuality, on respect, and that among us, those who have more money should also not just repress the northern people by trying to drive the agenda because we have more money. It has to be based on mutuality. It has to be based on really helping the South develop with the resources that we have in the South. So, but finally, in Africa, as I said, it's a big continent. There are a lot of lessons from within Africa, and we need to have a lot of Africa partnership and cooperation as well so that African countries can learn from one another. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much.